Welcome back, casuals. It's Will and we are back for a weekly episode of MMA Q&A, and I want to start off by saying a massive thank you for everyone that dropped their questions in the YouTube community tab on the post. It's very much appreciated. The engagement across all the platforms is very much appreciated, and we are growing. There's no doubt about it. We are growing. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, we are getting there. So thanks for the engagement and keeping up the community. Very much appreciated. Anyway, all of that out of the way, let's jump into the good stuff. Let's jump into the Q&A and let's jump into the first question, which is, should the UFC book an interim fight for Usman's injury? The cold hard answer to this is yes. Now, I started off 2 weeks ago by saying no. And the truth of that is because, of course, we know Leon Edwards is fighting for the title. And that little piece inside of me said, pay-per-view, UFC London, Leon Edwards, Conor Usman. I may have even heard in the underworld of the MMA world that that was potentially going to happen. Potentially, a big potentially. But of course, as we know now, Usman is injured. It looks like he's going to be out for the rest of the year. He's having an issue with his hand. The tendons in his hand are not getting the blood supply they need, aren't getting the nutrients, aren't getting enriched with all that good stuff. A title fight in regards to the interim, it only makes sense. Now, what panics me and worries me with Leon Edwards is he's always so close to that title, and then something happens to drop down, kill the momentum, and then the MMA world just replenishes. Because this world moves very, very quickly. And when you have someone like Leon Edwards, who is not the most outspoken, he's not the most outlandish human being on this earth, nor on social media, nor is he posting a ton of content, it's quite easy for him to get submerged in the MMA world. So I hate it every time that something like this happens. If there is an interim belt, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that it is Leon Edwards on 50% of that fight card. But who is the other 50%? I'm going to be honest. It is not Colby Covington, before anyone says that. I'm kicking Colby firmly to the curb. He needs to be a top contender. There's a new wave of hungry and very talented welterweights, and he needs to go and face some. There's people at the top of the welterweight tree who are doing very, very good things. Insert someone like Belal Muhammad. Now, yes, I know he's not the most exciting and not the biggest draw, which is why I think he won't get this interim fight. But I want to see him against the likes of Colby Covington. And Colby needs to take a fight like that, because I think he needs 2 wins to fight for the title again. Definitely. Which tees it up for one man. Hamza Chimaev. It only makes sense. They have a little bit of a narrative before because they said they would fight each other. But Hamza Chimaev is obviously coming off that very impressive win against Gilbert Burns. An incredible fight of the year contender. We haven't seen him in a 5-round. So that could get a little bit dicey, especially against someone like Leon Edwards. But Hamza does his bit for pay-per-views, and that will be a massive draw and an incredible fight to headline any fight night or any pay-per-view. So I would love to see that. Of course, not a fight night. There's a belt on the line. You know what I mean. Hamza Chimaev, Leon Edwards, that's the fight to make interim title. And then winner, of course, gets Conor Usman next year. The next question. Do I think judges should be held accountable? Yes. Absolutely, unequivocally, 100% yes. Everyone else in this sport is held accountable for what happens. Whether it's the ref, whether it's coaches, whether it's the corners, whether it's the fighters. Everyone is held accountable for their jobs. So we're not asking for special treatment when we say that the judges have to be as well. And it only makes sense. Now, I do want to start this conversation by saying we never appreciate, recognise or realise when the judges do a good job or a right job. So, of course, we're going to overinflate when they do a bad job. But it has been happening more than frequently quite recently. And a massive topic of conversation at the moment is open scoring. Now, if you follow Errol Hawani, if you watch the MMA Hour, if you have him in any capacity of your social media platforms, you will know he is a big advocate for open scoring. So why not jump into that topic of discussion? Because I've got a couple of thoughts and feelings on it. Now, I want to start off by saying I came into the conversation very neutral. I was happy to hear either side. I was personally for it, but I wanted to hear why people were against it. And as of yet, I have not been convinced. I have not heard one reasonable argument of why it shouldn't be there, apart from the fact that people are over romanticizing it as it's fighting It's fight to the death. It's what it's always been. It's a little bit of a washed out. It's a little bit of a played out argument now. I think especially coming into 2022 and trying to evolve and grow this sport, which is still very young. Which takes me on to my next point. MVP. MVP came onto the MMA hour and he said he wasn't a massive advocate for it, but there was one reason above all other reasons of why we need open scoring, and it's the best reason that I've heard. So what was it? When you are sitting there watching the fights and you have a casual, a neutral, a non-fan come over, scroll past, or they're flicking on the TV, it's a Saturday night and they flick on BT Sport or ESPN if you're watching this stateside, they're watching a grappling exchange, they've never seen MMA before, and they ask, who's winning? Of course you can sit there and you can tell the person, but when they're by themselves and they have no grasp or concept on the sport, there's no answer for that, which just means they get disinterested very quickly. So if we're looking to bring on new fans to this sport, if we're looking to grow it, evolve it, bring in new eyeballs, bring in more money, more sponsorships, more deals, better opportunities for fighters, more fighter development, better sports facilities. If we're looking to grow this as a whole, we have to have open scoring for the simple fact that people that have never seen the sport have no idea what is going on. If you are a sports fan and you're watching this video, you can think back a number of times to when you've been flicking on the TV and a random sport that maybe you don't watch a lot of is on, and it catches your engagement for about 5 minutes because you can see the score and it's fairly close, and maybe it's coming towards the end of the set or the end of the game, or it's the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and you want to see how it sort of plays out. We've all been there, or at least I've been there a lot of times, but in MMA you don't have that. So people get disinterested very quickly, especially in a world where people are scanning through things as quickly as possible. And if they don't have that anchor point, if they don't have that recognition to something, they get disengaged so quickly. So I think that definitely needs to be factored in. Now, there's a million other points, and I want to hear your points on it, but I won't dive into it too much. But I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued why people fight against it, because it makes perfect sense to me. These fighters have so much on the line. It's not just 50% of their purse, but they're fighting for their careers quite often. They're fighting to not be barraged with abuse online, which is a harsh reality of this sport. There's so many factors that go into this. There's so many things that we have to consider that I don't feel like the argument of it's what we've always done, it builds anticipation at the end of the fight. I don't think that's good enough anymore, and I don't think it's strong enough of an argument to overcome open scoring. Now, can I see it being implemented in the UFC anytime soon? Absolutely not. Do I think it should be? Absolutely. And do I think that judges should be more accountable? Absolutely. Now, Dominic Cruz made a good point, and I'll make this my last point on this. Dominic Cruz made a good point of who's training the judges? Who trains those? Who do we know who the judges are and their recent history, and have they fought and have they got experience, and do they interact with the fighters? Because there are a lot of nuances around that. It's a lot of a responsibility to hold when you're looking at the sport of MMA. Of course, the violence that goes into it and what rests in the balance between loss and win. We need high level judges. So that's a topic of conversation for a different time, but yes, they need to be held accountable for sure. What's more important, strength training or cardio? Now, I don't want to sit on the fence with this, and I'm not going to give some fluffy answer of they're both important and you need to be well rounded and an athlete and I'm going to give you a real answer. Of course, strength is important. It's very important. And if you're very evenly matched with a fighter, strength can often be that bit that just tips you over the edge. We've seen that play out 101 times. If you're going to push me to an answer and what fighters say, I'm going to say cardio. Because you can be as strong as you like. You can hit as hard as you like. If you don't have cardio, you don't have anything. And it always reminds me of something which I heard Michael Bisping say. He had a kickboxing fight when he was a young teenager, and he hadn't really been training for it, and he'd been going out quite a lot, and he hadn't had his gas tank where he needed it to be, and he was in the second round, he was knackered and he was getting beaten up, and he said it was the worst feeling he had ever experienced. What was born of that? One of the best cardio kings we've ever seen in the UFC in Michael Bisping. Back in his time, he had some of the highest striking outputs. We saw his relentless style and his relentless pressure. So we saw the proof in the pudding. So I'm going to have to go with cardio for this, because when it hits the 4th round and you're being slammed on your back and ground and pound, and then you get to your feet and then bang, you're back on your back and you're trying to scramble and get away, and someone's punching you in the face and your nose broke and your leg hurts because they've been kicking you in the shin. If you don't have cardio, it's going to be very difficult to win those fights. Now, of course, strength is important, but I'm going cardio on this one, which makes Colby so impressive. Which front kick was the best? Machida, Silva, or Chandler? This is a good question. This is a really good question. Now, they all have their perks and they all have their reasons of why you could argue that they should be pound for pound best front kick ever. Machida was the grace he done it with. When he bowed and prayed for his opponent at the end, when he was laying literally unconscious on the canvas, that was something beautiful and terrifying all in once, and it was an incredible encapsule moment of MMA. So I do love that. Anderson Silva is one of the most beautiful strikers you're ever likely to see in the UFC, and the way that his hands were so loose and relaxed, and bang, snapped it on the chin as soon as you even saw it. He was laying stiff. A thing of beauty. I'm going to have to go Michael Chandler on this one. Now, this could be recency bias, and I didn't even want to have to pick this one because watching that Tony Ferguson knockout was one of the most devastating times I've had as a UFC fan. Now, was it the most graceful and beautiful? Potentially not. But was it the most devastating? Personally, yes. It was horrible. Seeing someone like Tony Ferguson, now we start putting nuances on it, the people they're facing. Tony Ferguson has never been knocked out. He's barely been knocked down. So seeing that happen was quite honestly terrifying, and seeing his stiff body at the end of it was horrible. So if we're talking effective, we're going to have to be talking Michael Chandler on this one. I like this question. Smoke a joint with the Diaz brothers or DMT with Joe Rogan? Now, I've never done either. If I were to weigh this up, if I was to have a look at the pros and cons. Now, if you're talking about smoking with the Diaz brothers, now, of course, on paper, that's a pretty cool thing to do, and there's not a lot of people out there that wouldn't want to smoke a joint with Nick or Nate, or both. But let's think about the actual logistics. You're sitting there with them, maybe you've just done a little bit of jiu-jitsu, you're getting a vegan smoothie or whatever it is they're drinking, kale and roasted peppers, and they're having hummus and snacks, and you're sitting in this little stoner bar. They're probably not speaking an awful lot. You want to hear these anecdotes and these stories of when he fought McGregor and the inner workings of the UFC and what goes on behind the curtain. But realistically, they're going to be sitting there, monged out, not having a lot of conversation, if I were to guess. Now, I'm still willing to take that risk, and that would still be a pretty cool thing to do. But if I'm thinking about it practically, I'm going to go down the Joe Rogan route. Now, of what I know of DMT, it's a quite powerful drug. Now, would you want to do that for the first time with someone like Joe Rogan sitting next to you? I don't know. It could be quite intense. People say they see God sometimes when they take this drug. So seeing God, having Joe Rogan there, it could get a bit of a confusing experience for your first time. I'm not going to lie. I don't know how that would end. So if we could sort of amalgamate the two, smoke a joint with Joe Rogan, now we're sort of talking. I think that could be quite a good experience. I'd love to pick his brain. I'd love to sit there for 4 hours and just chat absolute waffle. Camera on, no camera on, whatever the situation. I would quite honestly love to do that. I like that question. Do I consider fighters that tested positive to be GOATs or not? Now, this is a very good question. And this is a question I've seen pop up quite a lot recently in the conversation around Jon Jones. And let's be honest, I don't think any fighter from a certain era is without... Well, actually, I'm thinking about it. The more I think about it, there's probably no fighter or champion that isn't without their drug conspiracies. Let's be honest. Now, of course, we have people like Jon Jones who have actually tested positive, so it's an easy conversation. There's a lot of conversation around the likes of GSP and Anderson Silva sometimes and Israel Adesanya. What's the true answer to that? And I say Anderson Silva, he did actually pop. So where do I stand? I don't know. It's a good question because it's such a hard conversation to have because it's so many what ifs. What if he wasn't on? What if they were? What if they were? What if he wasn't? And it gets all a bit messy and a bit murky, so I have to sort of take things at face value. Now, is that fair? Probably not, because you're enhancing yourself in a physical fist fight, which I think is a very low form of human being. But my moral standpoint out of this? I kind of do. It's hard to remember all champions and all their competitors and drugs and non-drugs, and those headlines, rightly or wrongly, get brushed aside very quickly. You almost only remember the skill, and you only remember what you see in fights, and that's what we go off when we're looking at fighters and when we're looking at performances. So, does it hinder it? A little bit. But do I knock the likes of John Jones and Anderson Silva out of my GOAT conversation because they popped? I don't. Not really. I don't think a lot of people do. And then it begs the question of, who do you put in there? So if you have to get rid of the likes of John Jones and Anderson Silva, and a lot of people suspect GSP, but let's keep them in there for the sake of it. Do we have to replenish the fighters? Do we have to put new people in there? Can't put Conor Usman in there because we know there's a ton of controversy around that, and I wouldn't even want to start to have that conversation. So, I don't know. It's an interesting one, but I'm going to say no on that. I don't change my mind, really. Who should Petr Yan and Sterling fight next? Now, this is something I've literally just made a post about. And the more I think about it, Petr Yan should fight Chito Vera. That's the fight to make, in my opinion. Chito Vera needs that next level opponent after a very impressive performance against Rob Font, and Petr Yan is the man to do it, in my opinion. Chito has this brilliant nature of being able to bring the dogfight out in people, and I feel like Petr Yan is one violent, aggressive man who will be more than happy to oblige with that offering. So I think Chito versus Yan is the fight to make. Stylistically, it's a very fun one. I think it will be a stand-up battle. We can expect 5 rounds of war. They're both very durable, very good striking, very hard hitters. Yeah, the more I say it, the more I want to make that fight. Chito Vera, Petr Yan. Get that in the diary. Sterling, on the other hand, and I was so close to calling him Raheem Sterling, not the person I'm referring to, Aljamain Sterling. That's an interesting conversation. Now, there's a lot to be said of TJ doesn't deserve it after one fight win, and I personally didn't even see him beating Corey Sandhagen. I personally don't believe he did, but at the end of the day, he did. So, yeah, I think that's the fight to make for him, realistically. If I just forget about everything else, the doping, the fight with Corey Sandhagen, which was a brilliant fight, by the way. And I want to give him props, actually. I said enough negative at the start of this. I want to give him props because he had one leg throughout the most of that fight. Now, I know Corey nearly snapped it off its bone, and that was the reason why. But he had one leg, and he had that nasty cut on his eye where the blood was just pouring into his eye. So he only had one eye throughout the fight, constantly just wiping it like this. And to beat someone like Corey Sandhagen, that elusive, that talented, that good off his back, that's tricky. So I've got to give him praise for that, and I've got to give him props. And I think stylistically, that's a very interesting matchup because TJ Dillashaw is a very good grappler. We know this. So that will be competitive on the ground. Now, of course, I think Aljamain Sterling still has the advantage there, but I feel like it will be quite evenly matched to the point maybe the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So then we're going to see it standing, which is an interesting dynamic to me because Aljamain Sterling's coming on leaps and bounds since when he started in the UFC. And he has that very wild, erratic, elusive sort of style at times where he kicks a lot, and then as soon as you enter range, he shoots on you. So that takedown's going to be there less against TJ Dillashaw, so he's going to have to keep him at range. But TJ also has a very exciting style, a very elusive style, a very herky-jerky style. He fights off a weird tempo. He switches stances very nicely. His strikes come from weird angles, a little bit like Aljamain. That's an interesting fight. I want to see that fight. I do want to see that fight. So that, yeah, make those. I was going to say Sean Maynard. Not the person. Sean Shelby, Mick Maynard, make the fights. Who should Conor McGregor consider for his fight back? Now, this is a question I've been sitting on for a little while because a lot of people have been asking me. But there's one man I feel like has sort of concreted his name at the top of this conversation. That man is Michael Chandler. Now, a lot of people are going to say about 155 champion Charles Oliveira, which is a reasonable conversation. Now, the problem with that is I don't think Conor McGregor is making 155 pounds anytime soon. Now, I said this a long time ago and I got berated in the comments for it, but I'm seeing more and more people say this and come to the realization now. I don't think he can make that weight for at least a little while. So 170 is going to be a good option. Now, we know Michael Chandler wants that fight at 170. 170 with Conor McGregor, and he just wants any fight at 170, whether it's Dustin Poirier, whether it's Colby, whether it's McGregor. He'll take any fight because he walks around quite heavy. I think the day after the fight he was 185 pounds, which is crazy. And of course, with that most recent win, his stock only rises. Now, you can say what you want about Chandler, him getting a title shot after one fight. He's got this many losses in the UFC. It doesn't really matter. We're talking about draw, we're talking about name value, and we're talking about excitement. And Michael Chandler has every single one in absolute abundance. And that win over Tony Ferguson absolutely excelled his name and his draw and his reach, which makes the Conor McGregor Michael Chandler fight a huge one in the lightweight division. Well, I say lightweight, we're realistically going to see that 170 pounds, but I think that makes sense. Now, of course, we can have the conversation of Tony versus Conor. Again, we can do that at 170. We can be flexible here. Neither fighter needs to fight at the 155. If Conor wants to get a title shot when it's there, he can get that. So that he doesn't need to work his way up into the 155 rankings. And also, Tony Ferguson's a little bit out of that picture at the moment, obviously, with his 4-fight losing streak. And he said he wants to go up. The more I think about it, the more it comes down to those two people, Tony Ferguson or Michael Chandler. And I'm probably swaying to the Michael Chandlers of this world because I think that's quite exciting. He gets touched. And if Conor McGregor touches you, it's not going to be an easy night. We can see McGregor at 170, so he hasn't got to cut a ton of weight. He can hit harder. And it'll be interesting. It'll be a fun little experiment. So yeah, I'm going to lock my answer in, please. 170, Michael Chandler. A huge headliner for a big pay-per-view. Sign me up. Predictions on Islam Makhachev v Charles Oliveira. The champion has a name. It's Charles the Bronx. Now, I've been saying for a long time, if you followed my channel, you would have known by now, I'm a big supporter of Islam Makhachev. I believe he is the second coming of Khabib 2.0. He does have exceedingly strong grappling credentials. He is a very good striker, an underrated striker. He does have good submissions. He does have incredible top pressure. However, the champion has a name. It's Charles Oliveira, and I'm done doubting the man. I'm going to be honest. I'm done doubting Charles Oliveira. And I thought about something the other day. We talk a lot about Charlie Olives, about his record and when he tapped and when he lost and the Paul Felder loss and all of these finer nuances. But he's 10-0. So I view him as an undefeated fighter. I view him as entering the UFC as a UFC lightweight and being undefeated. Or his last fight was against Paul Felder. Now, I'm going to sort of scrub that off because that was the last one and that was a long time ago. But we look at the stylistic matchup. Obviously, we know the grappling credentials of Islam. But when we look at Charlie Olives now, we know that he's happy for you to take him to the ground. Now, the conversation's going to be a little bit different because of the top pressure of Islam. And he's going to be so smothering and his grip's going to be so tight and there's not going to be a lot of separation. So it's going to be hard for Charles to throw up triangles and arm bars and the things he usually catches people with. He's not going to be able to slip and take the back as easy with Islam as he is, for example, Dustin Poirier or Justin Gaethje, who don't have that innate grappling instinct. But Oliveira is one of, if not the hardest hitting lightweight at the moment. Pound for pound, he's one of the hardest hitters in the UFC. Now, we look at the Justin Gaethje fight, and that's exactly what he said. So we know he's happy to stand up. And he's got all the advantages there. Yes, I think Islam's a good striker. But is he as good as Charlie Olives? Absolutely not. Not in my opinion. The diversity of Charlie Olives' striking is very underrated. His Muay Thai clinch, his knees, his elbows, his close work, his at-range work, his power shots, his left, his straights, his hooks, everything is so tight and succinct and beautiful because he knows he can throw reckless abandon because if he gets touched or if he gets hit or if he's in an uncomfortable position, he lies on his back like he's having a day out at the beach and he invites you in. Now, of course, Islam's going to be very accepting of that position, but it's not to say that he can't get submitted. It's not to say that he can't create a scramble and create a crazy scramble where he can sink something in. So I think that's a very interesting fight. Now, of course, Islam has all the potential to go in there and really grind out a decision where he keeps him on his back for 5 rounds, doesn't do a lot of offense, and tries to not lose rather than win. I think Charlie Olives can stop him. I think he can keep it standing long enough to switch him off, or at least knock him down. And if he knocks him down, I think he can finish him. And I think he can take a back. I think he can wrap a neck. And I think, yes, he can cash a check. Charlie Olives is not getting slept on anymore in Casual's corner. So as high as I was on Islam Makhachev, I've got to put respect on one of the pound for pound best fighters in the world at the moment. Champion has a name. Charles Oliveira. And the last question is, who should Michael Chandler fight next? Now, I know I've just done a whole segment on how I feel like the McGregor and Chandler fight is the one to make. But for the sake of conversation, let's go down a different avenue. Let's explore a different option because there are plenty of matchups out there that we want to see. I think the next logical one is Dustin Poirier. I think the next logical move is to make Michael Chandler versus Dustin Poirier at 170 pounds. Neither one of them really want to make that cut again. Both of them realistically want a stand-up fight where they haven't got to worry about getting choked out, where they haven't got to worry about grappling too much and they can stand up and put on an entertaining show. I feel like that's the fight to make. I feel like Michael Chandler really has cemented himself as one of the most exciting fighters on the roster at the moment, and we've seen that with his recent fights, and we know the pedigree and the excitement and the striking and the boxing skills that comes along with Dustin Poirier. And to be honest, I really want to see him at 170. I really want to see Dustin Poirier not cut weight, stay at his natural size, and see where his output goes from there. We see with any fighter, when you have to make that cut and when you have to make that taxing, grueling process on your body, it takes a little bit away from you. So if I can see a fully unleashed version of Dustin Poirier, that's exactly what I want. And the same goes for Michael Chandler, who was walking, like I just said, around about 185 pounds the day after he had his fight, which is crazy. So I think that's the fight to make. That wraps us up for this week's episode of our MMA Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. If you've got one for next week's episode, please drop it in the comments, drop it in the community tab. If you haven't already, hit subscribe if you like the content. And as always, I appreciate the support and the engagement. It goes a very long way. And the community is growing. I've got some exciting projects in the pipeline that I cannot wait to share with you. As always, look after yourselves. Take care. I've been Casual's Corner. You've been a pleasure. Peace.